narratives ultimately like sit in culture, and that ultimately I think shapes policy. And so it was important for us to put out something to influence in that way. I don't know, how do you guys think about it?
I think that's actually really interesting, because this trade-off that we have between scale and also making sure that, you know, the policy or the intervention that we're trying to design is actually rooted in the local context of the communities that we're working with, as against sort of scaling it up. What are we losing in the process? Are we losing specificity and local context, and are we sacrificing that at the altar of sort of scale, which naturally happens when you're trying to do something at a much more larger, broader level? And that actually really ties in with the question I also wanted to ask you about why am I always being researched? Why Am I Always Being Researched takes head on the need to drive research that is truly embedded in the communities that it seeks to serve and remove any unintended biases. What are the biggest mistakes you see in organizations, perhaps even Chicago Beyond in the beginning, make with respect to ignoring communities in their work, in the research, and in designing the programs?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I think for us, there's two things that jump out at me. So one is just being overly reliant on researchers to give us the direction. And there's so much, and I really do mean this, there's so much value and knowledge that come from like nonprofit leaders and people that are actually on the ground actually doing the work. And I noticed early on at Chicago Beyond, we would get in these conversations. We're setting up research studies, and there's a nonprofit partner in the room, there's researchers in the room, there's us. And Chicago Beyond and the nonprofit partner was almost like deferential to the researcher, right? Of like, well, you tell us what it is and what do we need to do, and you tell us. But part of what we put out, Why Am I Always Being Researched, is because we felt that just doesn't lead us ultimately to like the best answers, because there's just by nature of whatever that researcher's experience is or was, or our experience at Chicago Beyond is or was, we come at it from our point of view. But there's power when we can like let go of those power dynamics. People are on an even playing field, and we're co-crafting things together. The best example I can think of is the research that is happening with Lawndale Christian Legal Center out in North Lawndale. Like those, I think the researchers would tell you this, the people in Lawndale Christian Legal Center would tell you this, and definitely the people at Chicago Beyond would tell you this. Like it's been a rough go at it. Like they have sat in rooms, 12, 15 people deep across those three entities and organizations, and really grappled with like, what are those essential questions? Grappled with like, what does it mean to conduct a randomized control trial? What implications does that really have? Like what, like these like real life things that ultimately don't get boiled down into like, some numbers that you see on a sheet of paper, but that really impact people's lives. And so that has been just a really powerful learning for us as an organization, is that we, just like the other two entities, come with this bias and assumptions, and that once we let go of that, we actually get to better answers for communities.
And do you find that the researchers are responsive? Because it's also a shift in the way they operate, right?
Yeah.
And it must be difficult for them.
Yeah, that's what I think too. It's got to be difficult. I mean, you guys have got to feel this when people come to you for like, they want you to like to solve the problem or give the answer. You ultimately, for myself, I ultimately feel like this pressure, like, well, I got to have the answer. I got to be the person that knows everything. And I think on all three sides, when we can come and say we're learning and doing this together, it takes pressure out of all three, and it becomes about the collective and the collaboration and what we can ultimately just build together to get to the answers that we seek.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
So I'd like to shift the conversation more towards philanthropy at large. In Anand Giridhar Das's book Winners Take All, which is a favorite book of yours as well, he talks about how philanthropy has become a convenient justification for plutocrats to maintain the status quo and maintain their elite status. There's also a conversation that's being had around the US presidential campaign where several candidates are talking about wealth taxes. So what do you think is the role of philanthropy in this context, and what needs to be changed?
So I think philanthropy is great at seeding ideas. There's a lot more freedom in philanthropy to sort of test and trial run things, right? Whereas I think if you're thinking about, a city or a state or something on a federal level, like to do testing, if you will, or it just becomes almost impossible. And so I think that philanthropy can do some interesting things there. It's what we're trying to do at Chicago Beyond, putting ideas out into the world. We can do that at a rapid pace. We can, fund things like Lawndale Christian Legal Center or ideas that community-based organizations have. But I don't think philanthropy's role is to solve anything. I think that, again, puts too much pressure and unrealistic pressure at that on philanthropy to somehow have all the answers. And we believe at Chicago Beyond that really the answers are embedded within community. They're embedded within the people who are most distressed by whatever the quote unquote, whatever the problem is. When I think about, my time at Finger High School as the principal, people will look at that, time and they'll rattle off all the things around the reduction in arrests, the reduction in dropout rate, and the doubling of graduation rates, and all those great things. And they'll say that I did it or, the team did it. But really, it was about the young people, and they had the answers all along. We as the adults and the dysfunctional ecosystem we had set up weren't listening to them. And it wasn't until we actually listened to them, heard what was wrong. So heard the stories of, a child walking back and forth and from school and seeing some of the things they had seen, or what was going on in people's homes, or, a child coming to my office saying, Ms. Dozier, I can't read, and that's why I'm acting out in that classroom. It wasn't until we truly listened that we could then begin to, build what we needed to build to be able to serve children well. And I think that is true here of philanthropy. Like, philanthropy needs to root itself in consciousness and solidarity and in true connection with communities. And once that happens, then the shift happens. And it doesn't become about some great idea in a boardroom that somebody has based on their values, their own personal values and their own life story. But it becomes rather this selfless act of listening to another human being's experience, validating that experience, and then showing up in the ways that that entity or human being can to help alleviate some of the pain and to help that human being or set of human beings get off on a better track, because ultimately that's what we all want, I think. I mean, ultimately, no matter where you sit in society on the wealth spectrum or the education spectrum, I really believe that people are good. I truly believe that. And I believe that we all want the best for one another. I think we just have some disagreements in how we get there. But, yeah.
That is actually a great way for me to sort of get into my last question as well. What you said about all of us being fundamentally good and caring for each other. And given that your experience as a principal at a high school, driving those kinds of results, and now as the founder CEO of Chicago Beyond, what is some advice? What is one thing that you would tell somebody who wants to work in this space and who wants to maybe start an impact investing firm? I know at least 2 people sitting in the studio want to do that, and is deterred by the sheer scale of it. What was perhaps the biggest challenge that you had to solve for, and how did you solve it?
So I would say one thing, if someone was interested in getting into impact investing, was just really around listening. There's so much. It's something I think, especially in this day and age with technology and kind of how we're all set up, there's this idea of, having to put a voice out there, having to say something, but there's or make a move to do something, but there's so much power in just listening. And I think when we just listen to others, we can ultimately find the answers that we're seeking. And I think that's so powerful. It's what we're trying to do at Chicago Beyond. It's really how Whole Philanthropy was built. It's how Why Am I Always Being Research was being built. It really had to do a lot with listening. We had the privilege to be able to listen and put all the voices together, but it really was other people's voices that allowed us to do that. In terms of the biggest problem to solve, and this is one I've really struggled with, and I wouldn't have said this maybe a decade ago, but I would say it now, just having seen all different vantage points of the system, right? And I mean the big ecosystem of like, the world, right, in a lot of ways. But it really is structural racism. There is so much, I think, built into the very fabric of how society is set up that drives a lot of what we are experiencing, not only in our own city, but across the country. I was at an interesting dinner recently, and there was a whole bunch of different people around the table, and we were having conversations around like poverty, and somebody asked the question of like, what drives poverty? And a brave soul spoke up. This person happened to be an older white male, and he spoke up and he was like, it's structural racism. And so then we unpacked all that and talked about that. And there was a lot of heat and debate about that because some people did not believe that and they were voicing their opinions. But then it was interesting because this other gentleman who's a different man, but another older white man spoke up, and he said, like one of two things has to be true. And he's like, I hope I don't offend anybody by this, but, this is just what I think. He said, if we look at the prison system, or we look at where schools typically fail, or we look at communities just here in our own city, or he started giving me all these kind of just broad reaching like data points, health outcomes, all this stuff. He said, we have to believe one of two things. Either there is inherently something wrong with Black and brown people, or they have been set up to fail. He was like, because all that stuff can't be happenstance. And that was really something that I thought it was really powerful. It kind of like, there was all this debate and stuff. And when he said that, it kind of settled the room. And we kind of just like a quiet moment. And you could see people's like wheels really turning about, well, what do I believe? Or is it like some third option that hasn't been discussed here? Like, is there something really inherently wrong with Black and brown people? Or is it structural, or is there some type of other option that we're not discussing here? But if those two are the options, like, what do I believe? And just cause for a really interesting conversation. So anyway, it gets me as I think about the different vantage points by which I've seen a lot of work here just across the country, not even specific to Chicago. There is a lot of, structural racism that is embedded within systems. And I think that I don't think it's anyone's intention oftentimes, but just because it's not an intention doesn't negate the harm that it actually does to people. And so I think that's what I'll say on that.
And that's a beautiful thought, because sometimes it's about intentionally not doing certain things as well. This has been a wonderful interview, Liz. Thank you so much for taking out the time to speak to us. We really had a wonderful time.
Thanks so much.
And that's a wrap on another episode of UC3P. Credits go to Sowmya Karun for producing and co-interviewing, Yash Kirkire for co-interviewing, and Olu Odigan for engineering and editing. Also, big thanks to Chicago Beyond for allowing us to record in their downtown office. Our assistant production managers are Arjun Mota, Olu Odigan, Sowmya Karun, and Suo Wu. Our communications director is Thomas Krasnation. Our finance director is Donovan Harvey. Our publisher is Haz Yano. Our intro music is Knockout 2 by The2B, and our outro music is Yes Yes Y'all by Matt Large. Our cover art was designed by Shirin Raban. If you want to hear more podcasts, check out our website, uc3p.org. And if you want to contact us, our email is theuc3p@gmail.com. My name is David Raban, and stay tuned. We'll be back next week with law professor and former U.S. Attorney Barbara McQuaid. Hi, this is David. What? Why are you laughing? Why are you laughing? I've been practicing, guys.
I can tell.